그리운 이들의 이름을 하나씩 아껴 불러봅니다. 잊지 않겠습니다.
I'm sure that many of you know or at least have heard of the horrible tragedy that occurred on April 16, 2014, known as the Sewol Ferry disaster. Before we dive into the full events that took place as well as the aftermath of the situation, I want to start off by giving a content warning, as some of the following accounts are first-hand accounts of loved ones who have lost their children due to the accident, and of students on the boat patiently waiting for further instructions to be given regarding the situation. I feel that hearing the accounts of those that have personal experience with what happened as well as hearing from those on board will give us a better view of just how desperate the situation was at the time and how it impacted their society at the time along with the government response to the situation. On the 15th of April, the ferry named Sewol departed Incheon Port, Korea 2 hours behind schedule with 476 passengers on board, 325 of which were students on a class trip to Jeju Island from Danwon High School in Ansan. The next morning at around 8:49 a.m. in the southwestern coast of South Korea, the Sewol had begun to sink, and at around 8:52 a.m. the first 119 call was made by a passenger aboard the ferry.
지금 타고 보신 배가 침몰한다는 소리예요? 아니면 옆에 있는 다른 배가 침몰한다는 소리예요? 배가 침몰한다요.
위치 말해주세요. 위치 배가 어디 있습니까?
위치를 잘 모르겠어요. 지금 여기가.
위치를 모른다고요? 거기 뭐 GPS 경위도 안 나오나요? 경도하고 위도? 배 이름이 뭡니까? 배 이름?
태월호요. 태월호.
At 8:55 a.m., the first mate placed the first official distress call from the bridge to Jeju Island Station. However, the first mate had forgotten their 2-hour delay the day prior and reported the ferry as being closer to Jeju than its actual position, which was just southwest of Jindo Island. The students had been on a school trip to Jeju Island, which was to be a couple of days away from home, as the trip to Jeju itself would be an overnight trip, with the students sleeping the night on the ferry. But this trip was far from safe. As the ferry made its way to Jeju Island, the crew decided to go through the Mongol Channel despite the Korean Maritime Safety Tribunal asking that Chung Hae-ji stop using the Mongol Channel after the 2003 oil tanker crash. But the shortcut saved the company money on fuel by cutting the travel time by 7.5 miles, and continued to use it despite the warning, and made an unsafe sharp turn which caused the ferry to lose balance.
현재 계실 위치에서 움직이지 마시고 주변에 잡을 수 있는 봉이나 잡고 대기해 주시기 바랍니다.
야 미쳤나봐. 이런 상황에서 막 그러지 않냐? 안전하니까 가만히 있으라고. 그리고 주행이 다 주행이 나오고 지역은 왜다 그러잖아. 그 지하철도 그렇잖아. 안전하니까 좀만 있어달라고 했는데 진짜 좀 무서운데.
우리 진짜로 이만큼 비운 거야. 진짜야 이거.
나가 사람들은 살고 이만큼
어쨌든 저희는 이렇게 인천항 가가지고 기다리고 있는데 갑자기 이제 출항을 못할 수도 있다는 소리를 들었어요. 저희가 봤을 당시에도 안개가 너무 많이 낀 거예요. 근데 우리는 그래도 한 번뿐인 수학 여행인데 당연히 가면 좋겠지라는 생각을 했고, 근데 그러다가 출항을 하는 거예요. 그 당시 막 이렇게 레크리에이션 같은 거 하면서 재밌게 놀고 있다가 그 다음날 이제 아침이 됐죠. 밥을 먹고 있는데 근데 그때도 저희는 기울어져 있는 상태로 밥을 먹는 느낌을 들었어요. 우리끼리 국물 기울어 있다고. 근데 우리는 파도 때문에 그냥 그런가 보다 이런 생각을 했고, 그때까지도 그냥 웃고 막 그랬어요. 처음에 뭐 그렇게 심각한 일이라고 못 느꼈죠. 근데 저희가 속보로 기사가 뜬 거예요. 그래서 그때부터 좀 심각성 느끼면서 뭐 애들 막 부모님한테 전화하기도 하고 저도 전화하고.
어디로 했대 세월호. 세월호 이렇게 이렇게. 그 소방관들 어떻습니까? 저희는 지금 뭐 거의 움직이지 못하고 있습니다. 어떻게 해야 될까요? 지금 바다에 어떻게 모르겠네.
On the day the Sewol ferry sank, live footage of the capsized boat slowly disappearing under the water was broadcast across South Korea. The first Coast Guard boat that arrived at the scene did little more than pick up the fleeting crew members, including the captain, Lee Jun-seok, while passengers were told to stay put. The disaster had been born of greed and negligence, as expressed by the New York Times. The owner of the Sewol had added extra berths, making the ferry top-heavy. On its final voyage, it was carrying twice the legal limit of cargo, having dumped most of the ballast water that would have helped stabilize it. regulators ruled the ship seaworthy despite its condition via falsified documents. The cargo and vehicles were also not properly secured, which meant that they could easily change the center of gravity of the ship if they swayed in any which direction. And when it made a 15-degree turn, which was 10 degrees above the recommended turn angle given the ship's and cargo's condition, it lost its balance as cargo was shoved to one side, making the ferry lose its center of gravity. An attempt was made to try to regain balance by having the water weight shifted. Unfortunately, this attempt at rebalancing the ship was unsuccessful, as a system that would make this possible, the anti-heeling system, was not operational. More than 150 regulators, crew members, ship inspectors, and officials from ferry and loading companies have been indicted for their roles in the disaster. South Korea tightened safety rules and made laws to crack down on corruption and companies that put profit ahead of safety. As the situation got more and more desperate, with the ferry tilting further as time continued to pass, many nearby ships and fishing boats had started to surround the Sewol in hopes of being able to aid in rescuing anyone they could, while the presidential office insisted on having a camera on the situation so that they could assess what was happening, further delaying the action that could have been executed, being that this was a dire situation. They then ordered the fishing boats to retreat. The only Coast Guard ship on site was the Patrol Boat 123, which left many wondering why more rescue ships weren't sent. It seems that only once the situation was extremely desperate with limited minutes left before the ferry completely capsized that people nearby finally decided to try to save those they could. Fishermen and poorly equipped rescuers tried desperately to break windows and save passengers trapped inside. Cell phones salvaged from the wreckage 3 years later showed videos of children frantically saying goodbye to their parents as the cold waves filled their cabins. To make matters worse, the government initially told the nation that all passengers had been rescued, when in reality, of the 476 people on board the Sewol, only 172 were actually rescued.
아까 진작 좀 내렸다고 그림이 됐어야 되는데 지금 그게 문제란 말이에요. 못 올라가면. 우리가 올라가고 유도한 게 보여줬어야 되는데 승객들은 거의 다 나왔어요, 배에서? 예. 그러면 대부분 다 나왔다는 얘기예요? 선생님은 없다는 이야기예요?
예, 그 전부터 계속 기울이면서부터 사람이 나와 있었기 때문에
예.
내부 수색은 정확하게 안 했는데
예.
거의 다 나간 걸로 지금 확인이 되는.
그러면은 선내에 일단 사람들이 거의 없는 걸로 봐야 되네요.
예, 예.
There had been 5 earlier crashes prior to the purchase of the Sewol ferry that Chunghae-jin Marine Corps ferry sailors had been responsible for due to poor safety conditions and pilotage from 2003 to 2011. Some experts say that these incidents alone should have been ground enough for regulators to revoke the company's license. Nothing was done on these accounts, and the company purchased the Sewol in the following year. Prior to the Sewol incident, Chunghae-jin would perform major modifications on the ferry when the state it was first bought in. The passenger capacity for the ferry was lower than Chunghae-jin required, so an additional deck and cabins were added, increasing the passenger capacity to 117. These passenger decks altered the center of gravity by making the ship more top-heavy than it originally was toward the stern. In order to balance this type of weight, it is usually recommended to have water that centers the boat and keeps it from losing balance, given the turns and sways that are often encountered when out at sea. There are ways to calculate the amount of water needed in order to counteract the cargo on deck to a certain point. Despite this, Chunghae-jin would choose to not follow these safety precautions by not handling any of their ferries near the recommended regulational standards. The fact that their cargo was not held down meant that any cargo on or below deck could easily move with sharp movements performed by the ferry itself. This would further alter the weight distribution, which caused the ferry to tilt and sink as it did. As previously stated, the crash of 2003 took place in the Mongol Channel when the company was asked by the Korean Maritime Safety Tribunal that Chunghae-ji stop using the Mongol Channel after the 2003 oil tanker crash, due to it being unnecessarily dangerous for only the slightest bit of difference. but the company insisted on using the route in order to save money, and despite the warning, made an unsafe sharp turn which caused the ferry to lose its current balance. The crew made an attempt to try and use the anti-heeling system in order to pump water from one side of the ferry so that it might regain balance. This attempt was unsuccessful due to the lack of operational pumps. As reported by Korea Now, the Supreme Court only upheld a life sentence for the captain of the sunken Sewol ferry. The courts deemed the other 3 leading crew members who fled the ship along with Lee to have simply been in a position where they had to follow the captain's orders. The 14 other crew members were also confirmed with prison terms ranging from 18 months to 7 years. The incident sparked outrage and protest known as the Candlelight Protests in order to demand justice for those that lost their lives aboard the Sewol, in an event that many felt could have been handled better and possibly even prevented. After 3 years and with the reinvestigation underway, they impeached the current president, and after the president was out of office, workers finally went to work to start the recovery of the Sewol ferry, and finally be able to bring those who lost their lives in the horrible disaster the opportunity to come home and finally be laid to rest.